So those are just a few thoughts. I see Bill Root there. Do you want to say anything about export controls? This is a former colleague of mine who knows more about export controls and sanctions than any living human being.
You mentioned we are out to lunch. You also mentioned that the Cold War is over. I would take issue on both accounts.
All right.
Especially in export controls, the U.S. government is treating China as the remaining Cold War enemy. And I recently, this afternoon as a matter of fact, attended a great decisions group concerned with Latin America, and the experts were telling us that we're out to lunch there too.
It's true.
And the interesting point was that maybe that's a good thing, because when we come back, we often do things that, in retrospect, would be better if we'd stayed out to lunch.
That's a good point. I agree with some of that.
I wonder whether that might not be the case vis-a-vis China, and perhaps also even India, where to cozy up to India at the price of selling nuclear non-proliferation short might not be such a hot idea either.
Well, it does depend on the kind of engagement we're talking about. I mean, I agree that benign neglect may be better for these countries than the wrong policy. I mean, as to whether the Cold War is over, of course, you have a point, because the key question, really the most basic question of all, is how is China's increasing involvement in the global economy and global society going to influence its domestic political transformation? And we don't know. I mean, that's the truth. If you project 20 years forward, a richer China that wants to kick the U.S. out of Asia and continue to repress its people, that's possible. You can't rule that out. Or an expansionist China, you can't rule that out. Alternatively, you look at where China's come from in the last 25 years, how much more freedom there is now than there was, how much capitalism there is now, and you project that forward 25 years, and then you might end up with a China that looks sort of like Singapore domestically, authoritarian capitalism, more or less, not complete freedom, but not a threatening country at all. And we reduce our military presence somewhat, but we're still there as a stabilizing force, and that's a perfectly livable solution. And we don't know the answer to that, so in that sense you could say it's not post-Cold War. What I meant by post-Cold War was the system of formal alliances that were so important. And this regional movement is interesting because it really brings closer together U.S. allies, traditional allies like Thailand and the Philippines, with countries that have not been friendly to the U.S. and are certainly not allies. And they're working together much more, and with the blessing of the Pacific Command, as far as I can tell. So I think I probably should refine this concept of out to lunch. I certainly don't want to, spread nuclear weapons around, but I do think, I'd be interested if any of you agree with this, I do think that even on the nuclear issue, we tend to focus, and this is true of narcotics as well, we tend to focus overwhelmingly on limiting the supply of these bad things, and we don't pay enough attention to the demand for these things. And I want a more balanced approach. What is it that makes people want to have nuclear weapons in the first place, and what can we do to, promote collective security, or whatever it is we can do? What kind of examples can we set ourselves to reduce our nuclear weapons? And with respect to drugs, why we have this huge market of drug users, and then we go spray somebody else's poppy fields. I mean, not a way to win friends and influence people if we're not doing enough at home. So this is my sort of supply-demand fixation. I've had this bee in my bonnet for a long time. Yes?
I agree. I would preface this by saying I agree with almost everything you said in response to the last question.
Mm.
But I'm wondering if part of the problem is also not on the ASEAN side, and this perhaps causes the disconnect on the American side. The ASEAN leaders, particularly our strategic partners out there, have a long history of basically trying to they will come to the United States and say that China is closing in on us. We're establishing these trade agreements with China, but we're worried about their influence. There used to be similar things with India. They've done it with Russia, with collaborating with the East Asia Summit in 2005. Sort of example of this is Ambassador Jan Chi of Singapore went to Houston in fall of 2005. He gave this speech basically to that very same effect. And Southeast Asia is under siege, and the United States must be more, must go to East Asia Summit, and all these things. American diplomats and defense officials that I talk to seem to understand that this is most of the calls, that this is part of the ASEAN strategy to get the United States to play more. And they decide that they're not going to fall into this trap. I think that's one of the reasons we stayed out of the East Asia Summit. So doesn't the United States have an obligation to say to our friends in ASEAN, look, we're listening to you, and don't try to hold these on.
Well, I actually know Chan Hongqi, and we talked about this. I think the way you stated, of course, I agree, and there is no imminent danger or even a medium-term danger, that China will somehow swallow ASEAN, and there is a certain amount of what you call crying wolf. But at the same time, what I fear is not that the U.S. I don't fear anything really dire in the near term. What I do fear is a gradual loss of voice, or a loss of our voice will gradually be drained of influence. That's what I fear. I actually started 3 years ago or so thinking we should try to be in the East Asia Summit group. I don't think that anymore. I don't think we do need a seat at the table. We're not in the European Union after all. And I'm not even worried about Fortress Asia. There's a manufacturers alliance in town that worries a lot about U.S. manufactured exports being shut out and so forth. I don't worry too much about that. I think as long as Singapore and Japan, Australia, and so on are out there, there's no Fortress Asia. But I do think that I think that if you look at our vital interests in the world, whether it's sea lanes of communication, open energy markets, a solution to some of these non-traditional threats, handling a whole range of issues, including arms races and things. I think we have to be in there, and I think the people I talk to in the U.S. will say that they engage with ASEAN all the time, but if this were an interagency meeting and we were having a disagreement on something, the person who wins is the one who can escalate, go up to the boss, and the boss has to be willing to spend political capital to call up some of his counterpart and pay attention. And that's what's missing. I think you're right about the self-serving nature of crying wolf. After all, I said in my own talk that the Southeast Asian motive was to try to play off the different rivals. But, if you're going to be a world leader, you have to be a world leader. And if you're not going to be a world leader, you at least have to be a world partner. And I don't think it's very difficult. I mean, it is difficult to get a president to travel, but I mean, the kinds of things I'm talking about are symbolic. I do believe we should offer to have a free trade agreement with ASEAN. Now, I am, as a trade policy person, I think the proliferation of these bilateral and sub-regional trade agreements are way less than optimal, and we all ought to be getting the Doha round to succeed. And as I said, some of these agreements are not worth the paper they're printed on in terms of real trade. But I think that the symbolism of having China-ASEAN free trade offer would, and I should have added this to your question, I think that would go, I think that would help a lot. And we wouldn't get it right away. I mean, the Southeast Asians wouldn't meet our standards. So we compromised some, but even so, they wouldn't meet our standards. We're talking quite a long time. But it's engagement, and it would say that we support, it would suggest that we support ASEAN's goals for a closer economic integration itself, and we're willing to open our markets in products that are important to Asians. We have a U.S.-Australia free trade agreement, which is a very good agreement, except we exempted sugar. I mean, for heaven's sake, this went very badly in Australia. And you can think about products in Southeast Asia that might be excluded as well, and that would have to be, negotiated. But I do think that, I take your point, but I still think that we can do more to engage. Regional, we need a regional strategy, not just a China strategy or a Japan strategy, I think. Who else?